Hi, Lizzie and Ruona. I think we're just waiting for Margaret to join and chair this session. I will have a quick discussion while we find out where Margaret is. If Vivette or Leslie can let me know so we can kick the session off. If there's an issue with Margaret, I'm happy to step in and chair it. But Leslie and Vivette in the chat session, can you just let us know where we are at with Margaret? Okay, let's give Margaret a couple more minutes. So everyone watching, just bear with us for a second. One of the downsides of technology, and Margaret, like me, is in Melbourne, Australia, so I assume that she's still awake but in desperate need of a coffee. We'll give her a minute or two, otherwise I'll step in and chair. I'll just try and call her.
I'm here.
Margaret, great to see you. I'm quite happy to hand over to you now to the session on why hasn't this got traction. So I will turn off my microphone and my camera. And Margaret, over to you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. So thanks everyone for the invitation to be part of this conference. It's terrific to be talking about both the problem and the solutions. My name is Margaret Simons. I'm a freelance journalist, an Australian freelance journalist and an author, and also a sometime journalism academic. And it's my great pleasure today to be chairing a session on why this issue isn't gaining as much traction as it deserves in the public space. Now I'm joined here by Ruona Meyer, who I will introduce in more detail shortly, and Lizzie Roberts, both of whom are going to speak for a few minutes on their particular experience and take on this topic. And then we've agreed in a little informal meeting earlier on that we'd very much like to talk about some of the difficulties of doing this kind of journalism, which we think are possibly underappreciated. Now, from my screen, we seem to have lost Ruona. I'm not sure what's happened there. Is it just me, or have others lost her as well? Yeah, okay, so we might go to you first, Lizzie, if that's all right. So Lizzie is a news reporter at the Daily Telegraph and Sunday Telegraph, where she writes about a wide variety of topics, including health, science, crime, and social affairs. She has a background in international relations and a keen interest in reporting topics such as global health and violence against women. So Lizzie, you're on mute at the moment, so please unmute yourself and over to you.
Hi, yeah, thank you for having me. Yeah, so as Margaret mentioned, I kind of have a background in international relations and human rights. I studied them, both those topics, for my bachelor's and my master's degrees. So I kind of have an interest in it academically and journalistically. So the way I kind of first became interested in the topic journalistically was I was working on a project for the Telegraph about charitable giving and kind of looking at how charities operate. And when exploring that, obviously the Oxfam scandal is one of the biggest kind of like UK examples of this topic being covered. But there are also smaller issues that don't get as much traction. For example, whether DBS checks for frontline aid workers are necessary or whether they are in place, and that wasn't getting as much attention at the time. During this, I connected with Andrew, who's obviously kind of running this conference, and heard about the work in his area, particularly using this genealogy tracking to find people who had fathered children with victims of, who had fathered children abroad who were recipients of foreign aid. And at that time, also the genealogy tracking was quite a popular topic, and there's obviously the case of the Golden State Killer was tracked down using this as well. So it all kind of connected, and it was quite interesting. I didn't actually end up writing that story about Andrew's work for about a year later, which I think also illustrates one of the questions that this panel is going to explore about why these issues don't get as much attention, or why reporters aren't able to cover things instantly. I knew that Andrew had an interesting story to tell, but there were multiple factors that kind of influence when you can actually publish something just because you think it is an interesting story to tell. When I did eventually do that story, it gained a lot of traction, and it was followed up by lots of other media outlets as well, kind of showing that, as soon as you get one big, interesting story. A lot of other papers will follow it on. It's just a case of getting that story out there in the first place. I'm not sure it's really such a black and white issue to say why. I'm not sure it's really a black and white issue to say why this hasn't gained traction or why it isn't well covered. As I mentioned, obviously the Times story was huge, and then also just this week they also did another story about there was new sexual misconduct allegations aimed at WHO workers in the DRC. And for the last 6 months, this was obviously touched on in the previous session, but the last 6 months, the International Development Committee's report into this has gained a lot of media coverage. But I suppose the question is more about, you know, what changes have occurred from these media reports, or have people and organisations been held to account? Has there been any governmental policy changes or process changes as a result of these media reports? Obviously, following the Times 2018 Oxfam story, the CEO was suspended, the UK government cut funding, and then also again this year, the government cut funding again due to further sexual assault allegations. And then obviously following the International Development Committee's report, the government also kind of said that it was going to review some changes, for example, looking at whether charities that don't actively ban aid workers from having sex with people they are helping, whether they should be at risk of losing their government funding, and the government was going to be looking into that issue. I think one of the big things about why this issue maybe doesn't get as much reporting, or why there isn't that much traction, is there is a journalistic theory called compassion fatigue. And basically what that is when you relentlessly see stories covering victims or violence, exploitation, the reader kind of gets a bit oversaturated and will tend to switch off. And in turn, that then makes it harder to get those stories into the paper or into the broadcast, because the editors know that the readers won't be engaging with that. And I mean, you know, there's been some research as to what solutions or what people can do to kind of combat this compassion fatigue. There's a researcher called Dr. Scott Meyer, who's from the University of Oregon, and he actually found there's no sort of magic bullet to getting rid of this compassion fatigue with certain topics. There's no sort of way to engage all audiences. And obviously there was kind of the mention of the Me Too movement as well. So not only is there sexual exploitation in the aid industry that's trying to get media coverage, but it's also, you know, just in general, just in the general population. And I think audiences just kind of get a bit tired of reading the same headlines. However bad that sounds, it is hard to kind of get people to remain interested. So yeah, I think that's kind of the main sort of reasons why it's hard to keep reporting on these topics. And we need kind of fresh, innovative ways and innovative solutions to the issue, which we're then able to report on and kind of garner readers' interests again.
Thanks very much, Lizzie. I think that's a terrific overview. I'd now like to introduce Ruona Meyer, who's a multimedia journalist and researcher with 18 years of experience across Nigeria, South Africa, the UK, Germany, and the Netherlands. Her investigative documentary, Sweet Sweet Codeine, was Emmy nominated and received the BBC News Award for Investigation of the Year and the One World Media Television Documentary Award. She's currently Africa Initiative Manager at the Solutions Journalism Network, which is a non-profit that advocates an approach of solutions journalism, an evidence-based mode of reporting on the responses to social problems. So Ruona, please, we'd like to hear your point of view on this topic.
Thank you, Margaret. First of all, apologies. Technology will fail you, even in the so-called developed world. It's great to be here. I'm very particular about the work that King's College is doing, the team, and Professor MacLeod, mainly because I have a personal connection to sexual exploitation of women and children. And it's that a family member of mine, an uncle, lived in Liberia at the time of the war. And when he returned, I was a teenager at this time. He had really horrific stories, traumatized totally by nightmares from what he had seen happen to women and children particularly. Now, even though that had not happened to him, and this is instructive in some of the things I will point to later, even though that trauma had not directly happened to him, he would tell us stories, and it was really a bad thing for him. Now, fast forward, I get into journalism, and I discovered that some of the victims of what we now know as sexual exploitation and abuse, SEA, had actually moved to Nigeria. From Sierra Leone, from Liberia, and in reporting and talking to them, that is the basis for the opinions I now have over the years, and also talking to fellow journalists, colleagues as well, that report the same thing. So I'll start with why the issue hasn't gained traction as it should. Number one is the pressures of evidence collation. There are cultural reasons why evidence cannot be collated properly. There are also scientific barriers. Now, we do know that unless there is the irrefutable proof of a child, evidence can be denatured, whether that's DNA. It can heal over time if it's assault on the body, or it is lost even when it's put in when it's photographed and it's filed away, it can be lost. Because of bad record keeping. And what this then means is that journalists often do not have these considerations in mind when they report. Even the victims as well do not know that, okay, this is how you collect evidence, this is how even the journalists don't know the questions to ask. So right off the bat, we have that barrier. Then the cultural barrier as well is the fact that in conflict reporting, women all over the world are not generally seen in these spaces, in these zones. There's a recent report that said 45% of 150 women from 120 countries, Reporters Without Borders said they had been discriminated against, 45% of 150 women, in the sense that they wanted to go to conflict reporting countries and they were not allowed as women to go. Now, what we see is something that has been alluded to already in the first, in the previous session. That is that there is no diversity in the people reporting these cases. Where it becomes a problem, a big problem for traction, is that culturally, in some of these zones, most of the zones, conflict zones, women and men do not even live together. You can't just go and interview a woman if you're a man. Now, even if you were allowed, the sensitivity of the topic means often someone of a different gender, of a different age, different religion, might not be able to get the best out of the story. And so this is another reason. The second thing is stigma is very powerful. Julia said this during the keynote, and I really keyed into it. So this is where stigma affects traction of stories directly. When the story is about a local aid worker, most of the time there is that community, family-based link where it will be used to silence or silence the victim and make them agree to a communal settling, a traditional settling of this case. If it is a foreign aid worker, then this is where vestiges of colonialism come in. Clearly, it is now seen as if you are speaking against the authority. Others may blame you for speaking against the people who are giving you aid. All of this connects to why people will not come out and speak. A third strand of stigma, which is what I saw in the women and children that had left where they were based to live in Nigeria, to live in Ghana, leave Liberia, come to Ghana, was that when misfortune happens, most times people are blamed. So the abuse that has happened to them is, of all the girls there, why was it you? Why was it you that fell pregnant? You've disgraced the family. If you are still seeking for justice, and then they leave. They don't want to talk about it. Now, even if all these things were okay, and a journalist said, let me do the story, a typical journalist in Africa said so, the potential for getting sued is high, very high. And we see lawsuits being weaponized a lot in this type of cases. They are weaponized at every stage. A reporter is going about, they are even just trying to find out facts about things that whistleblowers have told them. They are threatened already. When they have their findings, if they are still stubborn enough, they ask for a response. We see particularly at the point of response, respond to these allegations, they are threatened immediately. And they don't have that money. They do not have that money. So elsewhere where legislation is used to silence journalists, we see this as well in SEA reporting. And finally, the priority of bigger media houses means that these stories do not gain traction. So I think I don't know which of the speakers previously alluded to this, but they said there's a non-interest by institutions to take on SEA cases. I'm of the opinion that this non-interest has filtered largely to media industries that are able to take on these cases. When we look at it too, when unlike people like the new humanitarian and Thomson Reuters that have the funds and they return to these stories, even when there are reports, journalists do not return. They don't return to the story, which is why it does not gain traction. So what do we do? Because I'm always about solutions. What can we do? So I do feel we should have relevant SEA reporting courses for African journalists that take, or journalists where, journalists where there are, there's a likelihood of conflict reporting or where there has been a historic trend of SEA cases. The reporting courses have to take into clear consideration these cultural and scientific barriers to reporting. It has to be clear. Newsrooms need to understand that there are some stories that maybe it's only women or young women in the case of children that can report this properly. Right. Those who investigate, whether they are academics, whether they are journalists, whether they are even the whistleblowers in the organizations, they must be very aware of what the vestiges of colonialism bring to bear on whistleblowing. Technically, people think you are speaking against authority. You should not go wrong. They are blamed already. So if even the people who are working in the aid industry in these organizations make it clear that, look, we are not your savior or your authority. We are here to serve you. And if you specifically go through this, you must come to us. That would help. Finally, I think we need to take the work that King's College does really seriously for two reasons. One, I cannot say how happy I am for what is being done here, because it means that even the irrefutable proof, the evidence where perpetrators cannot deny, is now being used to set an example. One of the main reasons why even victims are able to be scared away is because they know that nothing comes out most of the time. So, but what this project is doing is it is ensuring that that story changes. The second thing and the final thing is that the work that is being done here and the need for traction is important because, unfortunately, conflict is going to increase. Conflict flashpoints are increasing across the world, even in Africa as we speak. And so what that means is that where there is conflict, there will be SEA, there will be the likelihood of blatant abuses. Therefore, we all need to actually, the quicker we get a system that deals with this at journalistic, academic, and aid organization level, the better for all of us. Sorry if I've taken too much time.
No, thanks so much, Ruona. That's great. And if I can just remind people watching, if you put any questions in the Q&A. But Lizzie, if I can just come to you, I think Ruona's spoken very eloquently, and certainly it is borne out by my own experience about the difficulties of the law being weaponised against journalism. And in the previous session, there was a lot of talk about whistleblowers. What's your experience of that, of defamation law, perhaps particularly as an issue here in Australia, but what's your experience of laws being weaponised against this kind of reporting?
Yeah, I mean, from the UK perspective, we have obviously defamation and libel, and if you report something that someone believes is defaming their character, then you can go to court. But we also have a regulatory body called IPSO. So it's kind of like a secondary check on our reporting, and obviously they are there for a good reason to ensure that the reporting we do is correct. But it is also quite a constraint, because when you think about whistleblowers or victims and you're going against a huge corporation, you know, that corporation has lawyers, that corporation's got international power, and you're just one journalist with a handful of victims. And however much you believe their stories, if you don't have enough evidence to corroborate their story, like down to a T, like you won't get it over the line legally. And I mean, in the UK, there's like you can't be forced to reveal your sources by a court of law, and journalists have gone to prison as well for not revealing their sources. So it's a very tricky field to try and do these sorts of stories, because you know it can take years to get enough evidence and enough corroboration of that evidence to actually get it over the line from your own legal team, let alone what the opposing legal team could come at you for. I mean, I had another story recently where I had whistleblowers, and it is very challenging, and it's also very stressful for journalists, which I don't think is maybe talked about that often. That, you know, it's not only that you're hearing the victim story, so you're also kind of it's very difficult to hear those stories and then also report them, but you're also then having this pressure from a legal point of view, and you're thinking, you know, that this is the right thing that you should be doing, but that pressure can also really put you off what you feel like is right to do. So yeah, I think there are a lot of kind of legal challenges which maybe aren't that obvious to the public, because a lot of people will think, you know, you can just tell anyone's story and it's fine, but we do actually have a lot of constraints on us as well.
Yes, well, it's certainly the case where I work, and has affected some of the work I'll be talking about later. Ruona, in Western media, the collapse of the advertising-supported business model has meant that just getting an airfare to go to somewhere to report firsthand can be an enormous problem, and you certainly won't be staying in classy hotels. Is this an issue in the regions that you've worked in?
Yes, this is an issue. At the same time, the fact that COVID meant people could not travel anywhere has actually meant that Western media is relying on African journalists to report. I think you raise a very good point, because this needs to continue, because there is, one, is cheaper to actually then use whatever funds you have to fund reporters on the ground. Two, it speaks to the inclusive nature of whatever reporting comes out of that. I'll give an example. It is a known fact in our profession, and I'm pretty sure there's been some academic evidence, but you know, I just want to stick on the right side, because if I had a link, I would put it there. But it's a known fact that when people see a different type of gender or race interviewing them about whatever topic, they will change their accounts in varying degrees. And as Lizzie was saying, this topic is so important that it's very crucial to get the facts at every time correctly. And so if we can be just that little bit more aware of these little nuances and make these changes, I think we will not only get reporting that is inclusive and gives victims more dignity, but it will likely gain more traction in the sense that it's actually good material. It's not run-of-the-mill or detached from the realities, because distance shows in reporting. You definitely know when there is physical or mental distance from a report.
Yes, yes. Thanks, Ruona. Now we have one question from the audience directed to you, Lizzie. I don't fully understand the question, but it seems to be saying, why do some organisations get more airtime in the media, if you like, or more attention when there's evidence being taken? I'm not sure whether that means action.
I'm not sure what they mean by the second part of their question, but I mean, I guess some organizations get more focus and airtime because they're bigger household names.
Like Oxfam, for example.
Yeah, so, you know, Oxfam or WHO, UN, like everyone will know who they are, so it makes it relative. And I mean, Peter Singer talks about this with, like, you know, you would jump in a pond to save a drowning child if you see them, but would you do the same for someone who lives across the world? And it's the same with like these big names. We're going to put them in the papers because we know that our readers will know who they are, so they'll care about it. But you know, if you talk about some
for example,
yeah, but if it's some small NGO, however like heinous the actions might be that they're doing, it's just a lot harder to get the interest in it, unfortunately.
Yes. Yes, I think that currency is always an issue. If you know that somebody is possibly donated to an Oxfam, for example, they're quite likely to get airplay. Okay, well, we're nearly out of time, and we don't have any other questions from the audience. So
there is one there about DRC. I'm not sure if I think Ruona.
Oh yes, I missed that one. Yes, so the Oxfam DRC putting victims' lives in danger. Ruona, do you want to say anything about that?
Right. Yeah. This is actually part of what what has been raised here and what I was touching on a bit. There are some general laws in ethics. You know, you don't do no harm when you report on your sources. Make sure that whatever is going on, they're not put, you know, in the public eye, and then in such a way that people can track them, stigmatize them, and all of that. I do think that in trying to negotiate that fine line between making sure that you show your proof and your evidence, harm is being caused. And the harm happens long after the reports have gone through the byline and the victims are sadly left on the ground. This ties into what I spoke about, saying when you're in front of somebody who is of a different race or gender, some people actually open up more. They are not aware of the harm that can come to them. We have cases where on the same story, for instance, in Nigeria, it was global, and these protests are happening. Nigerian-based journalists try to speak to sources. They don't speak to them. The ones that speak do not go on the record. But when a foreign organization came in, they all went on the record. Now, when you look at it, that is their choice, right? They can decide to do that. However, this question is good because if someone says, I'm going to go on the record, I'm happy to go on the record, are you sure it is the best thing for them in the long run? Now, that has to now stop with us as journalists, to be honest. Even when someone says, oh, I'll go on the record, you have to know that, look, they've said yes. What's going to happen when I leave with my microphone? Are they saying yes just because it's me and I've sort of pushed in a way that it's better if you go on the record? even if they do, how can I manage this in a way that there is irrefutable proof, my story is of standard, but they don't get into trouble? So I think journalists just need to be more aware of these things.
I think that's frequently an issue in all kinds of journalism, dealing with vulnerable people, getting informed consent, but making sure that it really is informed consent, that people have a full appreciation of what they're doing. We could go on for hours, but unfortunately we are out of time. So there's going to be a brief coffee break now, and then at 11:30 we will be beginning a two-part session on finding the fathers, and I'll be talking again about some of the work I've been doing in the Philippines in that respect. So look forward to seeing you all again then, and thanks very much, Lizzie and Ruona.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.